When we talk of a narcissistic parent, the children grow up constantly worried that they might do something that might make their parent pissed, hurt, or angry. One type of narcissism, which is the overt one, which we call as grandiose narcissism, who are the extremely charming ones. On the other hand, the introverted ones, who are very defensive, avoidant, but very common to both of these, being extremely self-centered and self-focused.
You're watching Zen-Brain. Most of us know the definition of a narcissist, an extremely self-centered person who has an exaggerated sense of self-importance. But there's a pathological and psychological side to narcissism as well. A word that is loosely being used across social media today to describe anyone and everyone you don't like or get along with, someone aggressive or someone who's dumped you or a troublesome boss, perhaps. But it's actually quite challenging. If you've grown up with a parent with a narcissistic personality disorder or are currently in a relationship with one, or if you suffer from it. I'm joined by Dr. Sachin Baliga, a psychiatrist who's also a postdoctoral fellow in non-invasive brain stimulation of serious psychiatric disorders. I hope I've got that right, Doc. And I've invited him to help us understand when narcissism turns into a disorder and what that means for people living with such narcissists. So thank you for joining me on Zen-Brain, Doc.
Yeah, sure, Shruti. Thank you for inviting me.
Doc, I want to begin by saying that we've received at least 2 emails and several comments urging us to discuss this issue, and we will get into each of that. But first, I mentioned that the word narcissist is being used very loosely across social media. So why don't you tell us who a narcissist really is and when it gets to become a disorder?
The term narcissist came from the Greek mythology about a person called Narcissus, who actually was so enchanted by his own looks and was so vain about his appearance that he was eventually cursed that the next time he'll see his own reflection, he'll fall in love with himself. In fact, Narcissus eventually died because once he started looking at his own reflection, he wasn't able to take his eyes off himself, and he eventually died at the corner of that lake, looking at his own reflection. So the entire concept of narcissism came from that idea, which we commonly used as an expression for people who are very vain about their appearance, who are much more into superficial appearance and looks. But then eventually, as time progressed, the concept evolved, and it's much more into the personality dynamics and the way the person looks at himself and the world. So, like you rightly said, when we talk of a person who is a narcissist, what we are talking of is someone who has a very exaggerated self-esteem about himself, the way he looks at himself as compared to the rest of the world. Secondary to this is a lot of need for admiration and a lot of need for being considered special or getting special treatment as compared to the others. When we talk of a personality disorder, we go into the territory of personality trait, which is much more intense, frequent, and much more damaging. So when we talk of those serious aspects, those will be the individuals who usually will not even be aware that they have this kind of a tendency in themselves or not even be willing to accept when pointed out. So the difference between narcissism and narcissistic personality is all about how intense is it, how frequently this comes in different parts of their life, and how serious, how disturbing it is. In their relationships, in their work, in their day-to-day environment.
When is it time to worry?
In general, if you talk of any kind of a psychiatric illness, we say it is an illness because we are talking about a person's moods and behaviors and emotions, and all of us go through a hell lot of them throughout their lives. We say something is a problem when it is persistently causing disturbances in your social functioning, interactions, occupation, work, relationships. So the same thing applies here as well. So when you have a part of your nature which is making you experience difficulty in relationships, be it with your own family members, with your friends, which is causing work-related problems, then we know that it's something that is serious.
So I want to get into an email of a son talking about his father who appears completely saintly and passive to the world, but is actually, according to him, supposedly a narcissist. His question is this: how can having a father with a narcissistic disorder affect family and especially kids?
That's a very tricky situation, and you'll be surprised how frequently we encounter situations where we grow, we see patients who go through this and years later realize. We see people who are married and are, their spouses are living with their in-laws now, and they start realizing for the first time when the spouse finds out that, hey, this is not a very right behavior that the person is doing. There are children who go through this, sometimes even not realizing that it is something that's a problem. When we talk of parent-child dynamics, what we are looking at is a very nurturing atmosphere where opinions are valued, your good aspects are promoted, you are taught certain things. Yeah, there's a very healthy discussion about emotions and what each person goes through. When we talk of a narcissistic parent, a lot of times the children grow up constantly worried that they might do something that might make their parent pissed, hurt, or angry. Angry most of the times. We are talking about children who are very frequently separated out into one that's a very golden child and the other that's a useless child. Sometimes these things are switched very quickly. A lot of times, you will have a parent who will constantly be bringing the conversation only towards themselves and their achievements. I am doing so much in my life. What are you up to? These are your choices in your career. Really, that's even a career worth doing. I'm ashamed of you. You will have parents who will be shaming their children in social situations, in functions, making fun of them, their appearances, their weight, their qualities, making fun of the education that they are doing. And they are generally very conditional when it comes to loving. Whereas a parent should be very unconditional. Conditional in the sense that only when what they are talking is or what they are asking for is done is when you are a golden child.
Correct.
Otherwise, there's a lot of anger and hatred and shaming involved.
Doc, these are topics that have several gray areas. Usually it's nuanced. Behavior is also nuanced, right? In something like this. You brought up a parent's reaction, and I want to ask you this. One of the comments that we got was inconsistent reactions when
Yes.
a child is living with a parent, but they aren't sure about how the parent is going to react about the same thing on a different day. One day it's okay if you're coming home late, but another day, because that parent's mood is off, insults the child. In discussions like this, especially narcissism, how do you know for sure that a parent is a narcissist or has this disorder? How do you know for sure?
So as you rightly said, what we are talking of is behaviors, and each and every person of us has a very different personality. When we talk of personality as well, all of us have mixtures of personalities. So we will have narcissistic traits which we will put to use when we have to, manage a crowd, go on stage, speak to people. We will have that charisma when we are in social situations. So when we are talking of someone who has a disorder, especially in terms of psychiatric illnesses, we are talking of somebody who is assessed by detailed interview. And when we talk of a personality related problem, we are talking of something that has been there right since their formative years, right since they have been young. They grew up, they were adolescents, they are adults. They were like this in college. They were there when they were with their partner in their workplace, which is their pervasive right since their younger ages. Although usually when we talk of personality disorders, we label somebody with a disorder only when they cross 18. But it's not like at 18 suddenly these things develop because the roots are always in the younger ages. We are talking of somebody who is evaluated in detail, and there are certain personality related assessments, certain personality related scales that are applied to an individual. And depending on the way they answer in that, their pattern of responding in that, also we get an idea as to how to diagnose a person. Otherwise, we are primarily talking in the realm of traits that, oh, this person has some traits of this person has some nature of this. But we are talking about disorder, it is purely on the basis of this.
I want to come back to that. I just want to specify here. You're talking about one narcissism being a personality trait, which could be good.
Yes.
We're talking about leadership qualities. We're talking about people who take the lead, who take the onus and are really aggressive, perhaps ambition driven, all of that.
Absolutely.
On one hand, they could be extremely positive personality traits.
Yes.
When does it become a disorder?
So when it becomes a disorder is when the same pattern of behavior is so intense and so toxic that it is causing them problems.
And
So
others'
we,
problems, right?
yes. So, for example, we are talking of the same problem who will manipulate others into getting what they want, who will absolutely disregard other person's emotions and only care about it when it gives them some kind of a benefit. We are talking of a person who will not think a second before twisting facts and say that I never said something like this when the spotlight is suddenly on them. We are talking about somebody who gaslights a person in a relationship so consistently that the other person's self-esteem is broken down and they start questioning what has happened in the first place. So we are talking about somebody who is not able to sustain a relationship. We are talking about somebody whose colleagues are disgruntled with them at work. We are talking of colleagues and juniors who are constantly worried as to what we might say or we might trigger that person the next day. So when we say disorder, it is about relationships and work and environment, which is affected in a negative way.
And there is toxicity. Now, one of the reasons why we are discussing narcissism today is because of all your comments, emails asking us to discuss topics which are otherwise never discussed. These are topics where there are more gray areas, like I said, than a concrete diagnosis. In a comment posted on Zen-Brain Doc, a young girl, approximately 32, supposedly in a long-term relationship with a narcissist who was 35, who's
Hmm.
isolated her from her family and friends
Hmm.
and made her completely dependent on him, whether it's financially, physically, and emotionally. And she's been affected mentally and emotionally, but he's banned her from seeking out a psychologist, and it's taken a toll on her, and she's become ill. She's not specified the illness. Now,
Hmm.
just
Hmm. Hmm.
before we
Hmm.
get
Hmm.
into the answer, I want to put out a disclaimer out there. This discussion is no way an alternative for professional assistance, and I urge you to seek professional psychiatric help if there is a problem. This is only a candid discussion so that we can discuss topics that are otherwise never discussed. So, Doc, it's over to you.
What you're talking of is what a person who has narcissistic personality traits, very intense, what they can do to a relationship. And as you rightly said, what you read out very much sounds like a person who is in a relationship with a spouse or a partner who has that. Most difficult part, which sometimes happens, which eventually makes the spouse or the partner realize, is that behind that entire facade of saying that you are the one who is dependent on me, what will you do without me? Yeah, you are nothing without me. There will be a lot of interactions in the form of you are so sensitive, you get triggered. I was just making fun of you. Behind that entire facade is a person who actually has a very low and very fragile self-esteem. So the day where a person who is going through a relationship like this starts to value their own self-esteem, starts to draw boundaries and gets clear about what they want and how they want to deal with this, you will generally see that the most or the biggest fear rather that a person who has narcissistic tendencies has is criticism or hatred or being told they are wrong. So a lot of narcissists, in fact, end up being lonely, being depressed. Depression and anxiety are one of the commonest psychiatric disorders in people who have narcissistic personality disorders, as high as 40-50% of them, because they don't manage to have stable relationships, friends. They are extremely lonely. People leave them, people are, away from them. And unfortunately, the kind of spouses or partners that stick with them are the ones who end up having their own self-esteem issues, because of which they actually start believing what the other person is telling them.
So, you spoke about them having fragile self esteem, right?
Yeah.
So, usually these people would be antisocial.
So when we talk of narcissists, if you talk as per research, there are two kind of narcissisms which we say, the overt ones and the covert ones. The overt ones are the ones who are generally the flamboyant ones, who are very social, extroverted, very talkative, charming. You meet them and you fall in love with them. That they are so enchanting to talk about. Many of them narcissists, it's not just about the words and thought process. We are talking of the concept that has come from the appearance. So you'll have people who are very much focused on the way they look and the way society perceives them, because the entire thought process is surrounded by wanting to be admired by people, wanting to be the center of attention. So you will have this one type of narcissism, which is the overt one, which we call as grandiose narcissism, who are the extremely charming ones. On the other hand, are the other ones who are very covert ones, the introverted ones, who are very defensive, avoidant, but something that is very common to both of these are is the primary aspect of being extremely self-centered, and self-focused.
So narcissists do not always have to be flamboyant, like you said. They could be
Yes,
introverts. I mean,
yes,
there's so
yes,
many
yes.
gray areas, but very interesting. You brought up charming people, wanting to be admired, this grandiosity that exists in people. It almost makes me wonder how perhaps even many professions require this kind of overt narcissists, like actors, people who are out there wanting this kind of attention. Like, do you find that they suffer from this?
Absolutely. In fact, there is a lot of research and there is a lot of thought process from psychologists now that when we talk of narcissists and antisocial personality disorders and individuals who experience this, we need to also start looking at this from a point of view that they are a very important part of society. Yeah, because they are required, and these we cannot really start treating them as outcasts and people who are problematic because these are the people at high positions. These are the people who take big decisions when you don't need or you don't have the bandwidth to take people's emotions into account and make major decisions. We want to have people who have leadership qualities and who can make very strong personas which people will emulate. So these are very important characteristics that are required in a person. But when it becomes a problem, then definitely it's something that can lead to a very bad situation and a downfall.
I was reading earlier, Doc, that narcissistic personality disorder, people who suffer from that may suffer from severely low self-esteem, like you mentioned.
Hmm, hmm, hmm,
But
hmm,
they
hmm.
also, when they break up or when they have relationships which break up, and they usually,
Hmm, 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 hmm.
they may miss the attention that they were getting, not necessarily the person themselves.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
It's all about them,
Them.
not
Yeah.
necessarily any, and that's why this lack of empathy that exists in most of the people
Hmm,
that talk
hmm,
about
hmm, hmm, hmm.
narcissism. And they very often, I believe, punish partners by withholding affection.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's where that dynamic, see, when we talk of a relationship, there is always a dynamics involved. Depending on what kind of a person you are, a relationship can only continue for so long when the other partner has certain things that you want and you have certain things that the other partner wants. So that is why you will have narcissists who will continue relationships by very much having a control on the amount of love and admiration that they give to their partner, although they will constantly require that from their partner. You will have partners whose self-esteem and their ego is shattered and completely in that person's control. You will have partners who will know that when things are being pointed towards me and I'm the one who is called as someone who is having a problem, will throw it to the other side and say that, you are the one who is overtly sensitive. They are the ones who will probably stop conversing completely with that person till that person's emotions are shattered completely, and eventually they come and say that, okay, I'm sorry that I did this, and finally accept their mistake for something that they have not done.
So they turn it around and blame the other person instead of taking a personal accountability. This article that I was reading, it mentioned the fact that they don't like to apologize.
See, when we talk of a personality disorder, the primary aspect of it is that the people don't think they are at fault. The people think that it's the world that's the problem. So that is why you will see people whose spouses will say that we need to go to a therapist, and the person will say that I don't need to go. You are the one who needs to go. They'll keep saying that, you are so sensitive, you get triggered by every single thing, that I am the one who is going through emotional abuse. I'm the one who's going through trauma. But when told, then why don't you come and talk to a psychologist about it? They'll say, I don't need to go.
Why don't they want to go to a psychologist? And this is something very interesting which came up in a discussion recently.
Hmm,
They
hmm, hmm.
don't want to go to a psychologist because a third person would see the dynamics between partners, right? And maybe bring it up. So even when we were talking about boundaries last week, we were talking about enmeshment between
Hmm, 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 hmm.
parent and a child, for instance. And it's only when a third person enters those dynamics
Enters.
can you
Yeah, yeah,
actually
yeah.
notice this.
Very right. And even before this thing is brought up, we are talking of a person who doesn't have that awareness that it is something that is because of them. So we are talking of a person who thinks that the other person is the one who is weak and meek and not able to manage issues. So
That's
we are talking of a person who lacks that empathy to understand that they are the ones who are causing all this. So that's why At the first instance, there will be no help-seeking behavior because they don't think they are in the wrong.
Exactly. They think they don't need help. I just want to specify over here that a narcissist can be a woman also. It's not always a man.
Yeah, so generally, when we talk of a diagnosis of a personality disorder, you can understand that it requires people to be assessed, for which it requires people to come forward. So that's why you will many often see that there will not be many studies on people with personality disorders because it requires you to be open to assess yourself. The second thing is that if we talk from the aspect of literature, the division between males and females will be around 70-30 kind of a thing, males more than females. But it's something that is very much seen in females as well.
It's very interesting. So, when you say that in order to label it a disorder, the person needs to come and be assessed. Now, the very premise of narcissism is they don't think that
Hmm.
in the
Hmm.
wrong and that they are suffering from anything. So, why should they even be evaluated? What can one do while living with such a partner and heal from living with
Hmm.
such a personality?
One of the first things that we tell people is to seek help because a lot of times they are not even aware that they have a partner who is having these tendencies. Like you said, there are sometimes cases where it's the friends, the family members who point out that, see, aren't you being manipulated here? Aren't you somebody who is always tired, exhausted, and at an edge? Because you are worried that this might trigger your spouse and that might cause your spouse to get angry at you and not speak at you for 2 days. And we are talking of spouses or partners here sometimes get into this relationship and get into a cycle where it just progresses the same way. So that's why what becomes very important here is to seek help so that you, for the first, realize what is going on. There will be many individuals who, for the first time, when they go for their own problems of depression and anxiety, and the psychologist or the psychiatrist talks and discusses with them, find out that, oh, their partner has narcissistic personality disorder, very likely from the description what the person gives. And that is a reason for your depression and anxiety. And then the struggle begins as to, we need your partner to come. We need your partner for evaluation. The two of you need to go together to a therapist. And they say that, they're not willing. They're not willing. They say that you are the one who's a problem. You think that I'm mad. You want to prove me that I'm mad. So the entire journey starts. So what we generally start with is helping the person heal so that they start valuing themselves. They start looking at themselves from a more genuine perspective and not from the eye of a manipulator who has completely shattered their self-esteem. We start with helping the person deal with their own emotions and start developing their strategies of dealing with their negative and toxic environment. Most importantly, we also start teaching them to develop boundaries because when we talk of a personality issue, it's a very repeated thing that is going to happen again and again and again. So it is when you start being very fixed consistently about what is right, what is wrong, this is something that I will not tolerate, this is something that is not going to be done, is when you can actually see if things are changing or not. Because, like I said, behind that entire facade is a person who has a very low self-esteem. And unfortunately, because of that, unfortunately, or for many people, fortunately, a lot of narcissists end up being depressed, lonely, isolated because of their own issues. So it is when the person who is the victim starts looking at themselves and realizes they are the one in power over whether they can be hurt, they cannot be hurt, how they want to deal with that relationship, whether they want to leave it, whether they want to work on it, is that the other person starts realizing whether they need to pull up their socks and do something about it. And that's when we also come to know how much that other person wants to work on it.
Doc, I want to make a point here. You spoke about relationships, whether they are parent-children relationships or love relationships. These are meant to be safe, secure places where even if you're in the wrong, you are pulled up for it, but not necessarily emotionally punished. There is a consistency in the reaction of your partner and your parent so that you don't end up repeating your mistakes. Often, when you start feeling insecure in that relationship, which is meant to be so secure, that's when the problem begins to arise. And number two, I just want to make a point from what you were saying about control. The moment you become aware of the fact that someone else controls you, whether it's at the workplace or whether work itself controls you, it's the first sign that you need to get control back of your own life. This lack of control over your life can make you severely stressed and I think this is the first step in you starting to evaluate or become self-aware as to who are the people around you and what their behavior is, and whether there is any toxic behavior that is coming towards you, right?
Absolutely. And as to how much power I have given to the outside world, and others. Definitely. That's where the healing begins, because then you start prioritizing as to what is important for you and your life. And through that, decide how things are going to be henceforth. But that's where even your own strengths and your own capabilities come into question, because you'll have a lot of people who have a extreme difficulty tackling these relationships or leaving relationships when it's in a situation, because over a period of time their own idea of themselves is so devalued or so marginalized that they don't believe that they can actually survive or they can actually do by themselves without
That's
that person.
And we come back to something we on Zen-Brain keep talking about, is stepping out of victimhood. Stop feeling like a victim,
Hmm,
because
hmm, hmm.
power can be with you. You have the power.
Yeah.
And this is what I would like to leave our viewers with. But one last thing before we go, in your experience, have there been people who have
Hmm.
successfully sought therapy, fight suffering from something like a narcissistic personality disorder, and have they healed from it themselves, or have their partners or their kids healed from it?
So, if we talk of partners and kids, definitely you will have. In fact, I would like to say that I saw a client just today, who were two children of a father who very clearly has a lot of symptoms, because it's someone who I have not personally assessed of narcissistic personality. And the kids finally figured out that the only way they could survive was getting out of that house and establishing control. Yeah. So one of the kids moved to Singapore. The other kid is living in the other part of the country, and you still have a situation here where even though that person is actively involved and progressing in their life, when they post photos on their common family chat, there are no reactions, nothing. But it is when they post something, you are supposed to put a thumbs up. You are supposed to ask how they are doing. In such minute things over the years, you can see. I mean, people who go through this themselves realize these things are so petty, but when you go through this right since your childhood, it completely changes the way you look at relationships. So definitely a lot of partners and children who go through this seek help, get better. They realize they can do with much better people. A lot of times, and again, like I say, you when we talk of narcissism, again, it's a spectrum. So you will have people who have some tendencies. You have some people who realize when time catches up with them that they have caused a lot of problems to themselves because of being this way in relationships. They have made their life into a zone of isolation. They have a situation where they are doing good, fairly good, be it professionally, occupation wise, but otherwise are in a very superficial friendship with people. Their colleagues don't really meet them, talk to them outside their work environment, and genuinely start questioning as to what is going on, and eventually reach a realization that, okay, there is something wrong with me. But there will also be those people who are so severe on the spectrum that they will not come to a psychiatrist or a psychologist more than a single time, because they simply don't think that there is something wrong with them. So it's again a very much of a spectrum, even on the road to recovery, where there will be a lot of hiccups for some people, but a lot of people in whom healing happens very beautifully and they reach a sense of peace.
Well, that's why we have these conversations, so that we can bring up issues which are otherwise nowhere discussed, right? Something like narcissism, which is a personality trait, as opposed to a disorder where somebody, after an evaluation, comes to the conclusion that this is severe. And like you said, it's on a spectrum, right? You don't know what that person is on that spectrum because there are so many gray areas. So definitely seek help, even if it is for yourself, if you're living with somebody with this disorder, just to figure out whether it is a problem and whether there is toxicity in the environment, which could affect you physically, mentally, and emotionally. So, on that note, thank you very much, Doc, for giving us an insight. We hope to see you back discussing more of these personality disorders because it's rampant. And I think more and more, as we become self-aware of what we are going through and what we are surrounded with, I think we will become happier as individuals.
Absolutely. And on
Thank
that
you.
note, thank you for inviting me as well.
Thank you.